Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're going to finish off our series on the great Protestant cover-up, this scandalous suppression of Protestant history. And if you've been following this series, and if you haven't, by the way, stop this video, go back to the first video and watch the previous videos first. In this series, we've shown how what a lot of Protestants don't know is in the 1820s, a small group of Scottish theologians and lay people attempted to force all other Protestants, not only in England, but also on the continent of Europe and even in America, to change Protestant Bibles in that they wanted to remove the so-called Apocrypha, which was there in the very beginning with the Reformers, and it continues through the early translations of the Bible in English. Well, this small group of Protestants attempted to force and did force the British and Foreign Bible Society cut off funding to all Protestant Bible societies who wished to produce the Bible as Protestants had historically produced it. And in previous episodes, we went into the committee statements and we looked at how they make claims that, interesting enough, now that these books have been removed from Protestant Bibles, and most Protestants aren't even aware of these books, much less than they were part of the Protestant Bible, now they're making opposite claims. For example, one of the reasons why these the Scottish, the Edinburgh Bible Society, wished these Protestant Bibles didn't have the Apocrypha was because they claimed it taught Catholic doctrine. This is something, again, that today you'll find commonly on social media, internet, even people I've talked to, who will deny that the Deuterocanon teaches certain Catholic doctrines. Well, that's interesting. It taught it when they wanted to get rid of these books, and now that the books are gone, now all of a sudden, apparently, they didn't teach it. Another interesting thing is that the Edinburgh Bible Society said these books need to be removed. Why? Because they claim to be inspired scripture. They give revelation from God. They ape the phraseology of scripture. And so therefore it needs to be removed because people might think it's inspired. Well, again, fast forward to today where the memory of these books are gone. And lo and behold, you find all over social media the claim that the so-called Apocrypha never claims to be inspired. Interesting enough. Another reason why they wanted these books removed was because they were afraid that if Protestants read the Bible as it has been given since the Martin Luther and the Reformers, since centuries, before the Synod of Dort moved the books to the back of the Bible, that they would become Catholic, that Protestants would become Catholic, and that Catholics who left the church and became Protestant would go back to Catholicism. And they actually believe that happened with the Toulouse edition of the Bible, which is very interesting, especially if you're a Protestant who believes that the scriptures are self-attesting. It's strange how this would be such a danger if that is true, especially since these books are segregated into an appendix and plainly marked to be Apocrypha and have all sorts of warnings not to be used, not to be held equal to scripture. Nevertheless, apparently the Deuterocanon seems to be self-attesting enough to cause this confusion. The last reason, of course, as we've noted, was that if Protestant societies circulate the Bible as it has historically been in Protestantism, because the Council of Trent affirmed the canon, they would be aiding and abetting Rome, that they had become instruments of the Roman Church by circulating the Bible with these books. And so these books needed to be removed. And the British and Foreign Bible Society acquiesced. And that brings up the great cover-up where you will see in Protestant sources, and we cited a couple, like F.F. Bruce and Bruce M. Metzger, where they just whitewash the whole incident and say, well, the Bible buying public was more than happy to accept books or scriptures without the so-called Apocrypha, and everybody lived happily ever after. Well, the fact of the matter is, as we've shown in previous episodes, was there was a huge revolt, and almost all of the Protestant societies on the continent basically told the British to keep their money. They're going to continue to publish Bibles just like it was handed on from the reformers and how they've used it for centuries. Well, now we come to the aftermath of the Bible societies, because this starts a long push, a long campaign to eventually standardize all Protestant Bibles so they don't have these books in them. And that takes a while, from the 1820s all the way through to about 1900s. This progress of sanitizing Protestant Bibles and getting rid of these embarrassing books that many Protestants don't want to talk about today. They don't want to debate the issue. In fact, they definitely don't want to talk about this apocryphal controversy. So that's what we're going to look at next on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the apocalypse is beginning right now. Now, the American Bible Society here in America never signed on to the historic Protestant Bible. It published Bibles only without these books. So if you have a Bible in the United States that has the so-called Apocrypha in it, prior to some of the new versions of like the Cambridge Paragraph Bible in the 1890s, you got it from the Geneva Bible or the old King James versions, which had the so-called Apocrypha in it. But once these Bible societies begin to sign on to smaller Protestant Bibles, Catholics began to react to it. And I found this very interesting note or observation that was made by Ray Ellen Billington in his work, The Protestant Crusade, 1800s to 1860. And in it, Billington notes that a misimpression was created by the attempted circulation of these sanitized, smaller, incomplete Protestant Bibles. Billington writes,
"A clash developed as soon as the American Bible Society attempted to spread the Protestant version of the Bible among Catholics. The indignation of the Catholic hierarchy and papal letters denouncing the society, all were interpreted by Protestants as an attack on the Bible, rather than on one version of the Bible. Thus the illusion was created that papists were hostile to the scriptures, and that their church rested not on divine, but on man-made authority. These beliefs bore particular weight with the populace under the fundamentalistic influence of the new measure. This supposed Catholic attack on the Bible interested the Church in the No Popery Crusade, and led them to take their first exploratory steps against Catholicism."
Now, I have to note, although Billington, I think, is speaking a truth, and I could see where this change in the format of the Protestant Bible would have caused a reaction from Catholics, and how that reaction probably was misinterpreted by Protestants. I don't think it's the only cause. I think there are other causes as well that Protestants suspected that Catholicism was not founded entirely on Scripture, and that they were somehow, that Catholics were somehow anti-biblical or anti-Bible. So I think there's other things that were also at work. But I think, nevertheless, it was a component, because obviously Catholics would refuse to accept these mutilated, smaller, incomplete Bibles. And that could be misinterpreted as an affront to the Bible itself. So you can see where already we're starting to get ripples and pushbacks and misunderstandings by the new format, or the new cut, as it was once called. Now, what's funny is, not only was there this rising tide to sanitize complete Protestant Bibles and reduce them to what they are today without the so-called Apocrypha, there was that tide even went into certain extremes. In the last episode, we talked about how the Edinburgh Bible Society advocated not only the eradication of the so-called apocryphal books in Protestant Bibles, but even the cross-references for the reader to these books, because even they were too dangerous. All memory needed to be erased. Well, that was taken to a certain extreme. In fact, there's one instance where an early translation of the Greek Septuagint, the Vaticanus, Textus Vaticanus, or Codex Vaticanus, I should say, was actually also trimmed, and the so-called Apocrypha of the Vaticanus Codex was omitted. And I wasn't aware about this, but I noticed this in several sources as I began to research this point. So here's a quote from Dubney. We've used him a couple of times in this series in his work, The Use of the Apocrypha in the Christian Church. And here's what Dubney has to say.
An astonishing instance of the suppression of the apocryphal books is afforded by a work in 2 volumes, published in 1844, entitled The Septuagint Version of the Old Testament According to the Vatican Text. Translated into English by Sir L.C.L. Brenton, Bart. With the exception of some of the additions to Esther, the removal of which would have caused, presumably, too great a laceration of the text. The Apocrypha is wholly omitted sub silentio. It would appear that the translator was ignorant of the existence of such books in the Vatican text. Yet surely, this was impossible.
Okay, let me set this up. Now, Dubney calls this an astonishing instance of suppression. And you want to highlight the word astonishing. But if you aren't familiar with what we're talking about, you won't realize how astonishing it is. What is the Codex Vaticanus? The Codex Vaticanus is one of a few complete Christian Bibles that we have from the ancient church. In fact, it's one of the earliest codices in existence, the Codex Vaticanus. Now, this codex, this Bible, bound Bible, if you will, includes Deuterocanonical books. Okay, that is part of the Codex Vaticanus. Now, in 1844, we have Brenton here, who publishes a translation of this Codex Vaticanus, but he restricts it only to the proto-canon, except for the Deuterocanonical sections within Esther. And he does so without alerting the reader that this translation really isn't the whole Vaticanus, but an incomplete Vaticanus reflecting the smaller Protestant Bible. So this is astonishing because it's basically false advertising. It's trying to give the impression to the reader that the most ancient Christian Bible had the Protestant canon in it, and it didn't have the so-called Apocrypha. And so in a way, older Protestant Bibles that did have these books are at least a little closer to the most ancient Bibles, in at least that they include these books, even though they separate them and degrade them, which the oldest Christian Bibles didn't. They intermixed them with the proto-canon, made no distinction between these books, which again makes it even more startling that the scholar would present his work as that of the Vatican text, when actually it's not. It is an expurgated version where the so-called Apocrypha was omitted, except for, of course, Deutero-Esther. Very shocking. And again, see how complete this eradication from the Protestant mind was attempted by some in scholarly circles. Now, as we move through the 1800s to the 1900s, we find that the struggle to retain Protestant Bibles in the format that it was given from the reformers is now starting to wane, and we're getting all sorts of peculiarities that are popping up because of it. And this brings up a real interesting episode that involves the coronation of King Edward VII, because at the coronation, the king is to take an oath on a Bible. And so let's go to F.F. Bruce, the Canon of Scripture, and he can fill in exactly what happened for this coronation.
When the British and Foreign Bible Society undertook to provide the copy of the Bible, for presentation to King Edward VII at his coronation, in 1902, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Frederick Temple, ruled that a mutilated Bible, one lacking the Apocrypha, was unacceptable for the purpose, and as the Society was prevented by its constitution from providing an unmutilated edition, a suitable copy had to be procured at short notice from another source.
So you see here, the British and Foreign Bible Society stopped publishing Bibles with the so-called Apocrypha, even though this is accepted as the format of the Bible by the Anglican Church. And so here we have the strange incident where the king is going to be coronated, and the British and Foreign Bible Society is unable to produce a Bible for the coronation. Why? Because it is mutilated. The only versions they have are incomplete versions of the Protestant Bible. And so a quick switch around had to be done so that the king could be receive his coronation with the proper format of the Bible. Again, so now you see how, this function, this historic memory of Protestant Bible is already coming into conflict with the practice of these Bible societies, causes this interesting ripple. Another thing too is in the early 1900s, interest in the so-called Apocrypha was making a little bit of a comeback. And I think this is kind of the last hurrah for Protestant Bibles with the so-called Apocrypha. And what happened is a journal had begun in England called the International Journal of the Apocrypha. And this lasted, I believe, from 1909, I believe. And this started in the early 1900s and lasted till about a little bit into World War I. And in it, we find the following advertising. Now, to set yourself up for this ad, all this series, I've been talking about Protestant Bibles being complete or incomplete and so on. Listen to this ad that was printed in the International Journal of the Apocrypha in 1908. It reads,
"Why use an incomplete Bible? The SPCK provides a complete Bible. It is not generally known that the only Bible which has legal and official, besides ecclesiastical warrant, contains the Apocrypha. The SPCK has been for years pressing on church people the importance of the Apocrypha, and every edition of the Bible on its list is sold with the Apocrypha at a very slight cost beyond that of the incomplete Bible. Cheap complete Bibles, i.e. Bible containing the Apocrypha."
So here you have a Protestant publisher saying that Protestant Bibles that don't have the so-called Apocrypha are incomplete, and that the only official, legal, ecclesiastical version of the Protestant Bible includes the so-called Apocrypha. And, also it harkens to something that I touched on a little bit, but I didn't really cover too much. Even though it was a very small minority that wanted to impose their idea of what the Protestant Bible ought to be and restrict it down to only the proto-canonical books and get rid of the Apocrypha, even though it was small, that move for smaller Protestant Bibles had a certain weight. Why? Because of economic pressure. It's a lot cheaper to print a Bible without certain books in it. The less books you print, the less paper, less ink, less man hours it takes to produce this book. And that's true for any book, and especially is true for the Bible. So Protestant publishers actually broke the law, and by publishing Bibles that didn't include these books, and their profit margins were a lot higher. That's why the British and Foreign Bible Society initially was attracted to printing Bibles without these books, because they could do it cheaper. And that was the goal, to make as many cheap Bibles as possible so they get the greatest circulation. Well, you can see a hearkening here in this ad, because the SPCK points out that they can actually give you a cheap, complete Bible. It's only just a little bit more money to have it as it ought to be. But you imagine that, opening up a magazine today, Christianity Today, and see an ad like this. People would be shocked. And hopefully you're shocked too, because what you're seeing is that if you're a Protestant, these are your Protestant forebears who are fighting for retaining the Bible as it was given from the Reformers. And as you can tell, they were up against it. They were up against it. So we have all sorts of after effects. You have that strange Septuagint where it's also even sanitized. You have Protestant scholars today who kind of whitewash the fact that only a few Bible societies signed on to the British Reformed Bible Society policy of not printing Bibles without the so-called Apocrypha. You have Protestants who are advocating for the so-called Apocrypha to be in their Protestant Bibles. We went through the history and so on. And unfortunately, by the time you get to the 1910s, 1920s, right coming up to World War II, I think it became clear to these conservative Protestants that they're losing the war in regards to retaining the Bible. And so I want to give you this. This is interesting. This is an excerpt by a Protestant pastor, Dr. Milo H. Gates. And it's a sermon that he gave on Bible Sunday, December 6th, 1915. So this is a sermon that I don't think Protestants have ever heard in their church, unless you're extremely, extremely old. Okay, so here's what Milo Gates preached on Bible Sunday.
The time has come when all real Protestants should demand from the Bible societies the whole Bible. The day was, and it was not long ago, when every true Protestant had as the motto on his banner, "The Bible and the Bible only, our rule of faith and practice." Therefore, the true Protestants should now make a fight for the restoration of the Bible. One of the greatest libraries of sacred writings is contained in what is known as the Apocrypha. It is the fault of Bible societies that this wonderful part of Holy Writ has been stolen from the Bible. If these Bible societies were truly Protestant, they would not commit such a grievous theft. They would not keep the Bible from the common people. What we need today is either a reform or the retirement of the so-called Bible societies. If they are permitted to go on, I fear that they will continue more seriously to hinder the use of the Holy Scriptures. What we need is a new Luther to arouse us, and to lead a new reformation for the freedom of the Bible. He will find its most powerful enemy, not at Rome, but in the Bible houses of the United States and England.
Protestants are aware of the so-called fight for the Bible against the Catholic Church. And all sorts of strange canards have been propounded about the church chaining Bibles, keeping Bibles away from people. A lot of that has to do with the Apocrypha controversy. But how many people have heard about the restoration of the Bible, the retention of the Bible, the fight for the Bible from Protestants? That these Protestant Bible societies in Britain and in America has stolen part of the Protestant Bible away from the faithful. And I think Milo Gates' sermon expresses that very fully, the travesty that occurred. And again, this travesty has been virtually erased from the memory within Protestants, so that today, when someone becomes a Protestant or they grow up, they're given a Bible. They're told that this is the Bible of the early Christians, which it isn't. It's not even the Bible of the early Protestants. It's a sanitized version that came from the 1820s through a handful of people in Scotland that imposed their beliefs basically on the rest of the Protestant population. And though many Protestants nobly fought to retain the Bible as it was given and as it was printed and used and read, nevertheless, that fight was lost by World War I. So today, most Protestants aren't even aware of these books. And this is even noted by Goodspeed in his story of the Apocrypha, where he says,
"Very few people nowadays know what the Apocrypha are, much less what they have to say."
This brings up the Apocrypha Apocalypse. Talk about an unveiling of the so-called Apocrypha. This history, like I said, has been forgotten. It's whitewashed, suppressed, ignored, downplayed, because what can you say? You know, the Deuterocanon is embarrassing for Protestants on a number of different issues. We've looked at it historically and so on. But the rejection of these books, I think, if I were Protestant, this would make me extremely angry, and I would feel like I was lied to. So that's the evidence, folks. Look into it for yourself. And until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. I hope you enjoyed it. By the way, if you like this video, please subscribe, hit the thumbs up, and tell your friends about it. We appreciate it. Bye-bye.